Microphone was turned off. I'll post last year's. I could teach it 12 times and it wouldn't make a difference. Okay. Excuse me? I'll post last year's. It's the same lecture.
No, not that. Like, just because it doesn't make any sense.
I don't. As if I care.
You know, but...
How about a movie?
This is something. There was fire at a house in San Diego, and when they got there, the firefighters stumbled upon a marijuana farm inside a converted garage, and they think the fire was started because people there were tampering with the wiring to accommodate, needing a lot of energy to grow pot. Here's the story from the local news.
Carelessness and cannabis triggered a house fire in San Diego. When firefighters put out the flames, they discovered an elaborate pot growing operation there in the garage. Firefighters say some of those marijuana plants did burn, but they also say one person was treated for smoke inhalation.
I inhaled so much smoke.
Where's the Doritos? It's Jimmy Kimmel. Okay, so this should be pretty much a review, just like last module was. Why do we ventilate patients? Well, one reason is we've got to remove CO2. Their cardiopulmonary system is not doing it adequately, so I need to do it by providing alveolar minute ventilation. I might need to ventilate simply because of tissue oxygenation problems. My patient's hypoxic. I want to fix that. May need to ventilate just to reduce dyspnea, especially short term, possibly overnight. Recharge the muscles. Okay, that's the last one there. So that's our goals. Classical indications for mechanical ventilation. Apnea is pretty obvious. If your patient's apneic, you probably need to ventilate them. Egan talks about type 1 and type 2 ventilatory failure, or type 1 and type 2 respiratory failure, excuse me. The first one, hypercapnic respiratory failure, meaning that the CO2 levels have risen. The second one is called hypoxemic or hypoxic respiratory failure, meaning the gas exchange mechanism is impairing the oxygenation ability. Either case, it's an indication to ventilate somebody. Now, there might be some other alternatives you could look at, but it certainly is an indication for it. And then finally, impending respiratory failure is where you look at the patient and you go, oh, their blood gases don't look too bad, but they look awful. Okay, we can intubate and ventilate now, or we can wait 5 minutes till they arrest and intubate and ventilate them then. Respiratory failure, again, is defined as the inability to move CO2 and O2. We end up with that. Shouldn't be anything new to you. Hypoventilation leads to respiratory acidosis, which also hypercapnia can lead to hypoxemia. So in the case of failure to ventilate, somebody who's apneic but doesn't have the functional ability to trigger a breath, could be because of drug overdose, could be because of spinal cord trauma, could be some neuromuscular disease that we learned about, Guillain-Barré or polio, something along that line. Can't eliminate CO2, it usually is because either a compliance or area resistance issue. And then finally, we can also have a patient in hypoxic failure where it's a refractory hypoxemia due to large level shunts. This all seems a review, right? So far, so good? Okay. So here's our acute hypercapnic respiratory failure. Classic example of where the CO2 rises. Bicarb hasn't changed that much. But this patient needs to be intubated and ventilated. pH typically we say below 7.25, PCO2 typically above 55. Chronic respiratory failure is the patients that we don't intubate and ventilate. This is your typical COPD patient. Leave them alone. And our favorite are acute on chronic, where in this case I have a COPD patient, by definition chronic respiratory failure, who develops a pneumonia and hypoxemia. They begin hyperventilating from their normal level of 55 down to 44, and that's a patient that we need to possibly intubate and ventilate, possibly just be able to maybe do non-invasive until we can clear up the pneumonia. Does that make sense?
Is the indicator there the bicarb level is
Yeah.
high,
Right.
and that's not going to change?
Not in acute phase.
Right.
So this is an acute respiratory alkalosis superimposed on a chronic ventilatory failure.
Right?
What's normal for them?
That bicarb number can be normal for them?
Yeah, yeah. But then the pH wouldn't be 7.5.
What is the conversion? What is
Bicarb divided by 0.6.
Okay.
You don't need to know that yet, but you will.
I know that.
Where did you pull that? Did we learn that?
I just made that shit up.
Well, she knew it. Where did it, how did she know?
Her and I have secret conversations.
Oh, like, I'm missing something.
She passed me a note on under the desk, so you didn't see it.
0.6 of bicarb. 0.6 of bicarb is what CO2 should be.
What their predicted CO2 will be. Stacy.
Interesting.
Absolutely. Rest them until they can support them until the pneumonia can be cleared. Dana. Okay. And how about a case of where I have a chronic ventilatory failure and now they got worse? So this is the same guy, bicarb of 33. Instead of his PCO2 being 55, he now ran into trouble, could not ventilate, and now you have basically an acute respiratory acidosis superimposed upon chronic ventilatory failure. What's the bicarb? So it's elevated. So he's got a chronic failure, but something drove the CO2 worse and made him acidotic. So these three blood gases, this is him normal. Same patient. This is him normal. He develops pneumonia, hyperventilates because of the hypoxemia, PCO2 drops, becomes alkalotic. Respiratory alkalosis superimposed on chronic ventilatory failure. We don't pay attention to him, we ignore him. He tires, he fatigues, he goes into ventilatory failure. So now we have an acute respiratory acidosis superimposed on a chronic ventilatory failure. I know I'm using big words there, but basically it's three different scenarios, all from the same patient, basically. No?
Who, me?
Yeah.
Why is not my glasses?
Oh, okay. I use that excuse too sometimes.
Well, yeah.
It is.
All right, and then finally, looking at a hypoxemic patient, this is a patient that necessarily looking at a CO2, I wouldn't necessarily intubate him. But if I was getting FiO2s over 60% need, and I was basically looking at something where you have a huge amount of shunting going on, especially if the patient, looking at this doesn't look that bad ventilation-wise, but if I look at him and he's breathing 40 times a minute and he's using accessory muscles, might be indicated as far as an impending. And that respiratory insufficiency is kind of that impending ventilatory failure. It's another name for it. But where the patient looks worse than the blood gases show. Okay? So you can't always just take a blood gas out of context. You have to take it within the context of what the patient looks like. So if I have a relatively normal looking blood gas, but the patient's breathing 40 times a minute, something's wrong. So here I have a minute ventilation of 15, say 2 to 3 times normal, but my PCO2 is elevated. So he's working a lot, but not generating a lot. That's going to be a problem. So we need to dig deeper on it. Okay. I think that's it.